Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. I just want to welcome my guest here, author of Joseph and Lucy Smith's Tunbridge Farm, an Archaeological and Landscape Study, written by Mark L. Staker and Donald L. Enders. Mark, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Appreciate you having me on.
So I was just off camera. I was talking to Mark and I said, I just really want to thank you for early on coming onto my program before Richard Bushman did and all these other big names, and the channel's grown, and to have somebody from the church historian's office come on my program was a real big deal to me, and it still is. And we had a fun time with your book, and it was just really cool this was one of the first books that a publisher sent me to as well, which I thought was really cool. Christopher Smith at John Whitmer Books sent this and another one to me. So basically the reason why I'm having you on is because we promised my audience in June, when we filmed this, that we were going to be having the results coming soon. And that was part of the reason why Rick Bennett put your videos up in June, because we thought by the end of June, beginning of July, the results would be in. But we learned a lot of lessons, you and I together, about what it takes to get pollen results. Now, just as a primer for my audience who haven't seen the first episode, Joseph and Lucy Smith farmed Tunbridge Farm, and but nobody really knows for sure. Now they know they grew apples and stuff like that, but they didn't know what all the different crops that they grew. So what they did was they did an excavation, and were able to excavate pollen samples from the period of time that they would have been farming the land. So why don't you talk a little bit about the process, what you learned, and how they actually extract these pollen spores?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'll give just a little bit of background about how this study came about and kind of what we were doing initially. And we did look at Joseph and Lucy Smith's first starter home site, their married home site, where they moved in with Joseph's parents, and then eventually they expanded and had a house there until they moved on to Randolph, Vermont. And there's a large industrial building site there. The nails we found at the site suggested that it had been built very early on by the Smith family, and was likely used by Joseph Smith Sr., because the nails were just about the time that he got married to Lucy. So we were really curious about that building. And Lucy then goes on to say that they cultivated the land. That sounds like, they plowed lots of fields and grew corn or wheat or whatever, and we didn't find that kind of evidence in the landscape. We found that the land had been almost not plowed. It was only plowed a few times just to kind of allow grass to grow there, we presumed, and get a dairy going. And so we had these questions in mind when we went ahead and published the book. And I suggested in the book, maybe we ought to do a pollen study at some point. And I have to confess that I did not know much about what that entailed, but I knew that they were done, and that if we did that, that would help us a bit figure out some of those details. So as we did the book launch, a number of people while we were online suggested, well, why don't you do the study? I'll give you some money to it, so on. And a lot of people suggested that they would support it. And I thought, well, it might be easier just to get a single grant. And so I was able, within our department, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints funds some personal scholarship, much like an academic institution would do. So I was able to get a grant to pursue this. And the questions primarily were, well, in this industrial building, did the Smiths grow or process hops, which is one of the things we knew that they could have been growing on the property, or did they process apples, making apple cider, which we also knew and had studied intently the apples that were on the property, or did they process ginseng, a third item that we knew that they were going to be growing. And so with those questions in mind, I contacted a palynologist, and a palynologist is that the word means a studier of dust, but they study pollen. And so this palynologist at the University of Utah in their geology department, Ken Peterson, agreed to do the project with the funding that I had gotten available to have him do that. And so under his direction, the owners of the property, Scott and Patricia Beavers, took 6 samples of dirt following specific instructions as to how those samples were collected and gathered in. And I assumed we would just get those to the palynologist, and in a couple of weeks he would have results. It took, I looked back at the data delivered them April 13th and did not get the results back until yesterday, which would be September 28th, where we sat down and talked about the preliminary draft of the report. And so this is still hot news, just off the press. Don't even have the final draft of the report yet, but I know enough about what was found that we can share with you some of what we learned from this process. So the geology department, their staff took these samples and ran them through a centrifuge, which pulls the pollen into a location where they need it so that they can consolidate that, not have to process everything. And then they take an acid and put that in to these samples. And I asked, well, isn't, the pollen is a plant material, isn't that going to eat away first? And it turns out, no, that even the rock and the dirt in the sample is eaten away by the acid before the pollen. It's so durable. And so they were able to consolidate this pollen down to specific examples that then they could use a 400 power microscope to look at each pollen grain. And you can tell by the shape the general species of this plant, not necessarily the specific variety. And so when we get to this, it does raise a few interesting details, but you can tell the general species. And so Ken took and counted each grain of pollen over a long period of time. Took days and days and days to do all that, and he got the results that then he was able to share. And indeed, they were really interesting. It suggests some, it's fun to kind of go back to the landscape 200 years ago and say, oh, well, this is kind of what it might look like. For example, Canadian hemlock. In the floor of this building, there was a lot of pollen for that, and in the samples that were taken outside as test samples, half that amount of the Canadian hemlock. That's a species that grows in more wet environments, and Ken explained, about the Little Ice Age and kind of the changes in climate that just changed right at 1850 is when that Little Ice Age ended. And so that suggested a higher rain content in the valley there when the Smiths arrived. And so the species were just a little bit different than I was assuming, by just kind of walking through woods and seeing what you could see. I knew that there had been some changes from the historical record, but not in this instance. And so knew that there was more Canadian hemlock when the Smiths arrived, and there was a lot of pine pollen in both samples, just because pine is such a heavy producer of pollen, it gets everywhere. But one of the surprises was cattail. We knew that there was a fan kind of wetlands, but had no idea that there had been cattails growing in this area when the Smith family settled it. And that suggests some things about how they then had to prepare the land and make everything work. And the other one that we were looking for and expecting, and indeed found, was hops. And it's listed in the report as cannabis. And that's where sometimes larger varieties can confuse you as to the exact variety that was being used, because some of you may recognize cannabis as also being the genus name for marijuana. But it's certain that the Smith family was not growing and processing marijuana just because of historical context and how things came in and are brought into areas. And we knew that hops had been grown in the area, and we could confirm that through a lot of other ways. And so that suggests that, okay, the Smith family was processing hops in this building because of the pollen samples that we found in the floor there. And that tells us then some things about them and about their background and about what they were trying to do. As Lucy mentioned, that they were cultivating the land. So I think it's a great insight. It goes on to explain some things when they moved to New Hampshire and other things that they're doing. It explains what they're trying to do, what's going on in their mind, and kind of some of that early background for the family. We didn't find any apple varieties. Well, 2 small grains, but probably just from some nearby trees, which was a surprise, but not for the palynologist. It was a surprise for me. He suggested that, well, there's not going to really be pollen on the apples, it's just on the blossoms. So if they're bringing an apple harvest in there to make cider, you're not going to get pollen in the building, really. And so that explains that. And I had hoped, for somehow that pollen on the ginseng roots, as they had gathered that and brought that into the building, had survived and confirmed that. But no ginseng. That doesn't mean that they weren't processing it there. They'd cut the tops off the plants. They harvest them in the fall, long after pollen is exuded, and they would have brought just the roots in. And so that's easily explained. No apple pollen, no ginseng pollen, but indeed pollen from hops. And so that suggests that one of the things that the family was growing and producing on their farm.
So ginseng and apples were kind of documented as a known, cash crops that they were dealing with. And then, but you kind of suspected hops was going to be involved, but nobody had ever been able to confirm this. Now, hops would have been primarily be used to be making beer, correct?
Right, and I suspect, Lucy doesn't mention, she just says cultivating the land, and you think, well, why didn't she just say what they were growing? She's dictating her narrative in the late 1840s, long after Joseph Smith Jr., her sons, received a revelation, about, actually, if you read the revelation carefully, it promotes the drinking of beer, which is, that drink of mild barley that's mentioned in there. But by the mid 1840s, they pulled back from that, additional revelation, and so beer is just not commonly drunk, and it's easier, I think, to just kind of not get into all of that by having to explain yourself, and you didn't know all these things earlier, in a different background. And so it's easier just to say, yeah, cultivating the land. And so it never ended up in the historic record.
It's amazing. And it's just so cool that I'm hearing this for the first time, audience. This is really awesome. Now, you actually, a while back, did give me the preliminary result that you thought it might have been hops, but then just to have that confirmation now, keep verified is very exciting. So now this changes the history. Now we know something about what was going on at Tunbridge Farm that we didn't know before, and you basically think that it was just one of those things that wasn't, because of the word of wisdom and everything like that, would probably just would have been more comfortable just not to even bring that up. But what about apples for making cider, like hard cider? Like, would that have been something that would look down upon?
Well, yeah, by that time it's kind of not as significant either. And Lucy does clearly mention apples and saving them in Norwich. They're raising apples. It turns out that the landlord that they are working for, Constant Murdoch, That's his business, is beer and cider, and he's shipping it downriver. And so I'm sure that this helps explain what they're doing there and that context. But Lucy needed to mention the apples because that's what saved them. It kept them going. And so she mentions that, and it's a little more natural. It's hard to get into her mind and to know why she's saying what she's saying and what she doesn't say. But in my mind, that's what she's just mentioning that, but not the other, just because it avoids having to explain yourself.
Okay, so now you had mentioned Canadian hemlock and cattails. Would these been pollen spores that just sort of naturally got in there, or were they using them for stuff to harvest or whatever? What were they, just pollens that made it
Just
in there?
naturally growing. The hemlock cover their land mostly when they arrive. That's what they're clearing and cutting out. There is some sugar maple, but surprise, I've assumed that the ground would be covered in sugar maple pollen. That's what's on the land today. Sugar maples everywhere, but not in the samples we took. It just because they were down on the floor, original floor level, and there just wasn't much sugar maple there. Which so that was a fostered thing that they tried to get more of in their area, but it wasn't as heavy there when they arrived as I assume. There were other species. Grass was not in the building. The grass pollens all around for the outside samples, but almost none in the building itself, which you would expect with an old growth forest. You don't have a lot of grass growing in a forest. And so that suggests kind of the clearing time, just right after they have cleared the fields, that this building was going up, which confirms what we're seeing in the archaeology as well. So that was a nice confirmation that we were capturing a period of time before the building was torn down and people had, the whole area was used as cattle pasture. And an interesting other detail was the dandelion seeds that we found. Dandelions were in Vermont early. The Puritans brought them over to their gardens as a medicinal plant from England. And I just assumed that because, that they disperse in the wind, and I assumed all the wind had just blown these dandelions up in Vermont and other places fairly quickly. They don't travel that quickly, but cattle don't digest the dandelion seeds and they carry them with them as they go places. So people such as the Smith family, Asel and Mary Smith, took their whole herd of cattle from Ipswich, Massachusetts, up to Vermont. It took 140 days, so I suspect by then the dandelion seeds were out, but other people took theirs up fairly quickly, and the cattle are spreading the dandelions around the area. It becomes an interesting phenomenon for the Smith family because there is, in 1815, cold weather that drives a lot of people out of Vermont, and there was such starvation that people were forced to eat the dandelion roots in the Green Mountains. And I have one source that says that the dandelions didn't come back for another 50 years. They so thoroughly ate them out of their mountains that they went extinct in Vermont for a while until they eventually cattle and perhaps later the wind brought them back. So that was something that you also see in these pollen samples where the dandelions weren't there early, but in the later samples they were.
Interesting. Just real quick, how many head of cattle did the Smiths bring with them?
I think 6 in the tax records in Massachusetts, and so they probably brought them all up with them.
Very interesting. Boy, it's just so fascinating, just those little soil samples, what they're telling you about so much history, some of the natural things that were around. Now, the cannabis, just real quick, that would also have been a naturally occurring plant, correct? That they would have found?
No, the hops, they brought them up from Massachusetts.
Okay.
and probably more than just the Smiths. I don't know if the Smiths
Oh,
brought them up or
okay.
some of their neighbors and they got them from them, but they're imported in
Okay.
into the area.
Okay. Do you think that there are further studies with the soil that you would consider doing in the future, or do you feel pretty satisfied that you've done a pretty thorough thing, or is this just a preliminary thing?
I think for this site, this is all we're going to do. There's a lot we could learn from some of our other sites, particularly the Smith Farm in New York. We could learn a lot from doing exactly the same kinds of studies.
So nobody's done anything at the Smith Farm in New York yet?
Not in terms of pollen.
Interesting. Are you going to be leading the charge in that?
Well, we'll have to see. I'm working on a lot of other things there at the Smith Farm, and so hopefully that's one of the things that we can incorporate into that.
Interesting. So just to, based on yesterday, you sat down and went over the preliminary results. What was your, what did you take, how did you feel after reading them? Was it pretty much everything you expected? What was your reaction to hearing the results for the first time yesterday?
It was, the hops result was one I was hoping for, and I had a heads up earlier that some grains of hops have been seen, and so I knew that we'd see something with that. The rest of it was largely, I knew the general landscape and it's been a time there, so I expected most of it. The cattails was, for me, the big surprise because I didn't have a heads up on that one and had no idea that they'd be in the valley where they were, and so that was of interest.
Fascinating. Well, that's great. So I want to thank you so much for going over this stuff with me. And I just thought, why don't we talk a little bit, because you've had a pretty busy summer. And as you and I have been communicating since June, you've been giving me updates, not only on the study, but also some of the projects you've been working on. Maybe just talk a little bit about what some of the current stuff you're doing.
Well, for my employer, I'm working on lots of historic sites projects that we've got going, but my personal projects primarily are building on this earlier research, trying to get it out. And so I'm doing a lot of writing right now to pull together a lot of research I've done. And I've got an article coming out in the Journal of Mormon History next April that details Joseph Smith Sr.'s ginseng trade. There's a lot of exciting stuff there. So I think I'll hold back on sharing it so that the journal can kind of release that. But it took me to London. I went through the East India Company records there, and to New York, to the John Jacob Astor Library there, and the other places to pull together some fun stuff on that project. So it'll be great to see that one when it comes out. And then I'm working on an extensive project, a major book with a colleague of mine. All of this is footnotes for that larger project. Don Enders, who spent almost 60 years doing archaeology at church history sites. And I'm trying to help him pull that together. And we're working on a history of the Smith family from, I'd say 1630 to 1830. But the early part doesn't give as much time. It's mostly the Smith family in Vermont and New York up until January of 1831.
Huh. You also were telling me you were involved in some kind of renovation project for one of the historic sites.
Yeah, working on some, helping to restore a number of sites where, there's always a building or furnishing issues or other things that we deal with on those sites.
Well, so when does this article come out in the Mormon History Association? You said in the spring?
In April, it's scheduled to come out.
It's in April of 2022. Okay, that's great. Well, I'm a member of MHA, so I look forward to getting my hands on that copy.
Watch for it.
Perhaps maybe when it comes out, we could maybe have you back on and you could talk about that as well.
I would love to do that. It ended up 84 pages of material got cut down to 20 pages. So there's a lot more to share that I'd love to share at some point.
Yeah, let's talk about the cut 64 pages, man. That's probably some good stuff in there.
Yeah.
So, and I do have one thing I have to request from you. And you're supposed to say, what's that?
What's that? Yeah.
When you were in Vermont, you told me that, of course, you saw some of the apple trees that the Smiths had planted and that the people who owned the property had eaten the apples. And you told me, I asked you, I said, okay, Mark, well, did you try one of the apples? And you said, no. Well, Mark, I need you to do this. Next time you're out there, you need to go out to the Tunbridge Farm and you need to eat one of those apples and come back and tell me how they were.
I would love to do that. I'd love to go meet with my friends out there and see them again and try some of those apples.
So maybe have an apple pie even. Who knows if they're made for that, but you never know. So,
Sure.
So we'll have you back for the apple report. So, folks, I just want to thank everybody for joining us on this adventure. And Mark, I just want to thank you for coming onto my program. Do you have any final words for my audience?
No, other than just to remind you that not all history has to come from documents. There are a lot of other things that we can learn about the past from, and I'm hoping that we can look at a lot of those other things in the future more often and get a better perspective of what has happened.
Yeah, we have soil samples, we have LiDAR. There's so many other ways to tell the story. Now, I won't tell you because I just was at Brent Ashworth's on Saturday. So we know documents are very important to him. So I won't let him know that. But I think he'll get a kick out of his pollen study results as well. So, well, thank you, Mark, for coming on. Folks, I just want to remind you to like and subscribe, hit the notification button to get informed when a new video comes on my YouTube channel. I just want to thank everybody for all the support that I've been receiving on this channel. I've got some more great guests coming, including Mark probably next spring. And everybody, we're going to get through this time of peril with the pandemic, and hopefully soon enough we'll return to normalcy. Have a great day.